in the glass tower at the center of the city. On a morning when the rain refused to stop, a woman named Amelia Carter wheeled herself to the head of a conference table, where 12 investors sat waiting like judges in a courtroom. She placed the final contract on the polished surface in front of her, her hand steady, even though her heart was not. One of the investors, a silver-haired man named Richard Kessler, slid a second folder across the table toward a man standing near the door in a worn brown coat that did not belong among the tailored suits. Kessler's voice was cold enough to fog the windows. "If you think you can save this company," he said, "sign first." The room erupted in quiet laughter, the kind that wealthy people use instead of applause. Nobody in that room knew that the man in the old coat had once built the very system every device on that table depended on to function. And nobody knew that only hours earlier, that same man had pulled Amelia Carter from a wreck that should have ended not just her career, but her life. The city outside the windows was gray and endless, rain sliding sideways against the glass, as though the whole building had been dropped into the middle of an ocean. And inside that boardroom the air felt just as unforgiving. Amelia had rehearsed this moment 100 times in her head the night before, telling herself she would not flinch no matter what words were used against her. But nothing had prepared her for the particular cruelty of watching people she once trusted enjoy her downfall out loud. When the pen finally touched the paper, the entire balance of power in that room shifted, though only one person in the building understood exactly how much. 3 months before that morning, Amelia Carter had been one of the youngest and most celebrated chief executives in the country, a woman who had built an artificial intelligence company worth billions of dollars before she turned 36. She had grown up chasing equations instead of friendships, coding late into the night while other teenagers went to parties, and by the time she was in her late 20s, she had already proven the doubters wrong more times than she could count. Her company, a firm called Halcyon Systems, powered logistics, healthcare scheduling, and financial forecasting for hundreds of businesses across the country. She was, by every measure that mattered to the people who measured such things, untouchable. Then came the accident. A car crash on a rain-slicked highway left her spine damaged beyond what any surgeon could fully repair. And though she survived, the doctors delivered a verdict that felt heavier than any boardroom failure ever could. She would not walk again. She remembered the exact way the doctor's voice had sounded delivering that sentence, flat and clinical, as though he were reading a weather forecast rather than rewriting the entire shape of her future, and she remembered even more clearly the silence that followed, the sound of machines beeping steadily, while she tried to absorb a sentence that refused to fit inside her mind. Within weeks, the investors who had once fought for a seat at her table began quietly making calls to each other instead of to her. And the stock price of Halcyon Systems began a slide that no press release could stop. Business magazines that had once put her face on their covers now ran headlines calling her the genius whose time had passed, as if her mind had been injured along with her legs. The company she had built from nothing stood on the edge of a hostile takeover, and the board, once loyal, began speaking of her in the past tense, even while she still sat 2 floors above them. Old friends stopped returning her calls within a week, replaced by lawyers who spoke in careful, distant language about transition plans and continuity, as if she were already a memory rather than a woman still very much alive, and still very much running her company from behind a desk that had been quietly rearranged to accommodate her chair. Reporters who once begged for interviews now printed anonymous quotes from unnamed sources close to the company, each one more damning than the last, painting a picture of a leader too broken to continue. Amelia read every article anyway, unable to stop herself, absorbing each cruel sentence like a wound she refused to let heal cleanly. The weeks of rehabilitation that followed the crash tested her in ways the company's collapse never could. Hours spent relearning how to move through a world that had not been built with her new body in mind. Doorframes suddenly too narrow, counters suddenly too high, a bathroom at her own house that had to be torn apart and rebuilt before she could use it without help. She refused a live-in-aid after the first week, insisting on learning to manage alone, even when the learning meant falling, sometimes literally, more times than she wanted to admit to anyone. Physical therapists praised her progress in careful, encouraging tones that she came to recognize as the same tone people use with children or the very old, a gentleness that felt, more often than not, like another form of being underestimated. She missed, more than she expected to, the simple architecture of walking into a room and being seen first as competent rather than fragile, and she spent long nights wondering whether the version of herself that other people now saw would ever again be allowed to stand at the front of anything. Amid all of that collapse, one man refused to walk away, though almost nobody had ever noticed him walking toward anything at all. His name was Daniel Brooks, a single father in his early 40s who made his living as an independent systems technician, moving from building to building, fixing servers, and wiring that larger companies no longer wanted to maintain in-house. He dressed the way a man dresses when he has learned that appearances rarely matter as much as people believe, in flannel shirts and jackets that had seen a decade of winters. Nobody in the tower where Halcyon Systems occupied 11 floors paid him more than a passing glance when he walked through the lobby with his toolbox, and that suited him fine because attention was the one thing Daniel Brooks had spent years trying to avoid. On the morning the investors gathered to force Amelia's hand, Daniel walked into that conference room anyway, uninvited, unannounced, and entirely unwelcome by every person seated at that table except the one whose life he had already saved. Richard Kessler looked him over once, decided he was nothing worth fearing, and delivered his challenge with a smile that assumed the matter was already settled. "Want to save the company?" he asked again, his tone dripping with condescension. "Then sign first." Daniel did not answer right away. He simply looked around the table at the faces staring back at him, some amused, some annoyed at the interruption, none of them curious enough to wonder why a stranger in work boots would walk into a meeting like this one uninvited. He had spent years cultivating exactly this kind of invisibility, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the old, familiar weight of being underestimated settle back onto his shoulders, like a coat he had not planned on wearing again. Daniel had raised his 2 children largely on his own after his wife's death, working double shifts and odd contracts to keep their small house running, while never once letting them see how close to the edge those years sometimes felt. He had turned down offers over the years that would have pulled him back into rooms exactly like this one. Rooms full of people who valued a person only for what they could extract from them, because he had learned the hard way that some kinds of success cost more than they were worth. His children were grown now, one working as a nurse in another state, the other finishing graduate school, and though neither of them appeared in the story unfolding inside that boardroom, both had shaped the man standing quietly near the door, patient in the face of insults, because he had weathered far worse and survived it with his sense of purpose intact. He called each of them every Sunday evening without fail, a small ritual he protected fiercely, no matter how demanding his work became. And it was that same steadiness, the habit of showing up for the people who needed him, regardless of how it looked to anyone else, that had carried him through the parking garage without a second of hesitation. 24 hours earlier, in the underground parking garage beneath the same glass tower, Amelia had been finishing a call with her chief financial officer while guiding her electric wheelchair toward the elevator bank, her mind so consumed by falling numbers that she barely noticed the flicker in the overhead lights. The garage was nearly empty at that hour, most employees having already gone home to escape the cold rain that had been falling since noon, and the concrete corridor amplified every sound into something sharper than it should have been. Without warning, the control panel on her chair sparked and seized, sending her forward down a ramp meant for cars rather than pedestrians. The wheels gaining speed against a slope she had no way to fight. She called out, though there was no one nearby to hear her, or so she believed. Daniel Brooks had been kneeling beside an electrical panel at the bottom of that same ramp, checking a wiring fault he had been called in to repair, and the sound of her voice cut through his concentration like a blade. He did not stop to think, because thinking would have cost the half-second that mattered most. He threw himself into the path of the runaway chair, absorbing the impact with his own body, and driving them both into the side railing before the chair could reach the open stairwell just beyond it. Both of them went down hard, Daniel taking the worst of it across his shoulder and back, Amelia shaken but unharmed beyond a few bruises and a racing heart. She thanked him breathlessly. "Still, it is nothing," he told her, already trying to stand, despite the pain radiating down his arm. Then, before she could ask his name or offer anything more than gratitude, he gathered his tools and disappeared down the corridor, leaving her alone with a stopped heart and a stranger's kindness she could not yet explain. She did not even know his name. She only knew that a man in a worn brown coat had appeared out of nowhere and given her back a life she had almost lost twice in one season. For the rest of that day, she found herself replaying the moment in fragments, the sound of metal scraping against the railing, the sudden weight of his body absorbing an impact that should have been hers alone, the strange calm in his eyes, as though throwing himself into danger cost him nothing at all. She asked the building's security office for footage of the garage, hoping to identify him, but the request got lost somewhere between departments, the way most small emergencies did inside a company as large as Halcyon, and within days the accident became just one more crisis buried beneath a dozen larger ones, demanding her attention. In the days that followed, the pressure inside Halcyon Systems grew heavier than anything Amelia had faced since founding the company. Investors called for emergency meetings. Board members who once praised her vision now whispered about succession plans behind closed doors. The financial press speculated endlessly about whether a woman in a wheelchair could still command the respect of a company built on speed, ambition, and relentless motion, as though her mind had somehow been diminished along with her legs. Competitors, sensing blood in the water, began courting her largest clients with promises of stability that Halcyon could no longer guarantee, sending polished representatives to dinners and conferences where they spoke in sympathetic tones about understanding if a company needed to plan for a future without its founder at the helm. One rival firm went so far as to offer a discounted contract to a hospital network that had relied on Halcyon's scheduling software for nearly 5 years. Timing the offer to arrive the same week, a magazine ran a particularly unflattering profile, questioning Amelia's ability to lead through crisis. She lost that account within the month, along with 2 smaller ones that followed shortly after, each departure covered by the press as further proof that the company's foundation was crumbling beneath her. The unspoken belief moving through every hallway and every phone call was simple and cruel. A leader who could not stand, could not lead. In one particularly bruising meeting, a junior board member suggested, delicately at first, and then with less and less tact as the discussion wore on, that perhaps it was time to consider bringing in an interim chief executive while Amelia focused on her recovery, as though recovery were a project with a defined end date rather than the rest of her life. Amelia sat through the entire suggestion without raising her voice, though her knuckles had gone white against the arms of her chair, and when she finally spoke, she reminded the room, calmly and precisely, of exactly how many of the company's founding patents still carried her name alone. The room went quiet, but she left that meeting understanding that the suggestion would return, dressed in slightly different language, until either she stepped aside or found a way to prove them all decisively wrong. Amelia tried to hide the toll it was taking, arriving early and leaving late, presenting a face of composure in every meeting even as her body screamed with a pain no painkiller could fully mute. At night, alone in her office long after the cleaning staff had gone home, she stopped eating properly and stopped sleeping altogether. Her eyes fixed on spreadsheets that told the same story from every angle. The company she had built was dying, and no one believed she could save it. It was during one of those long, hollow nights that Daniel Brooks, working a quiet overnight contract to patch a firewall for the building's security division, stumbled across something buried deep inside Halcyon's servers that made him stop breathing for a moment. A vulnerability, deliberate and carefully hidden, sat inside the company's core infrastructure like a splinter no one had bothered to notice, and the deeper he looked, the more certain he became that it had not been placed there by accident. He sat back in his chair for a long moment, staring at the lines of code glowing on his screen, weighing the quiet, comfortable anonymity he had built for himself against the cost of staying silent while a company employing thousands of people bled out from a wound someone had cut deliberately. It would have been easy to walk away, to finish his contract and move on to the next building, the next server room, the next stranger's problem that was not truly his to solve. Something in him, some old instinct he thought he had buried along with the rest of his former life, would not let him look away. What almost no one at Halcyon Systems knew was that Daniel Brooks had not always been a man who fixed other people's wiring for a living. Years earlier, under a different name recognized in very different rooms, he had been one of the original architects of the very framework that companies like Halcyon now built their entire businesses upon, a foundational system that had quietly reshaped an entire industry before most people had ever heard the word artificial intelligence spoken outside a laboratory. He had walked away from that world after losing his wife to illness, choosing instead to raise his children quietly and rebuild a life stripped of spotlights and shareholder calls, believing that peace mattered more than recognition ever could. His children were grown now, living their own lives in other cities, and Daniel had settled into a solitary rhythm of small jobs and smaller ambitions, content to remain invisible. But invisibility became impossible once he saw what was hiding inside Halcyon Systems. He sent a detailed warning to the company's technical department, laying out the vulnerability in plain language anyone with authority should have understood. No one answered. He sent it again, more urgently, attaching evidence that should have triggered alarms throughout the building. Still nothing. Finally, unwilling to watch a company collapse from a wound it did not even know it carried, he walked into the lobby of the tower and asked to speak with someone in leadership, only to be turned away by a receptionist who barely looked up from her screen and a security guard who laughed at the idea of a man in work boots demanding executive access. The guard told him, not unkindly but with the particular carelessness of someone who has said the same dismissal 100 times before, that people claiming urgent business with the executive floor came through that lobby every week, and that none of them ever turned out to be telling the truth. Daniel did not argue. He simply left his written warning at the front desk, watched the receptionist, set it aside without so much as glancing at the subject line, and walked back out into the rain, uncertain whether the paper would ever reach anyone who mattered at all. It was only by chance, while reviewing lobby security footage for an unrelated matter, that Amelia caught a glimpse of his face on a monitor and felt something click into place with the force of a struck bell. She recognized him instantly. That was the man from the parking garage. That was the man who had saved her life and vanished without a name. She rewound the footage twice more just to be certain, watching the way he carried himself through the lobby with the same quiet, unhurried economy of movement she remembered from the instant he threw himself into her path, and something in her chest tightened with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief she did not have time to fully examine. She had spent weeks half hoping to see him again, never imagining that the answer would appear so plainly on a monitor not 30 feet from her office door. She gave the order herself, overriding every objection from her assistant, and had Daniel brought up to the executive floor before the day was finished. He walked into her office carrying a folder thick with printed evidence, and for the first time in months, Amelia found herself facing someone who looked at her not with pity or calculation, but simply as an equal worth speaking too plainly. He laid out 3 separate security vulnerabilities embedded across different layers of the company's infrastructure, each one severe enough to cripple operations if triggered at the wrong moment. He described 2 instances of financial irregularities buried inside recent transaction records, numbers that had been quietly rerouted in ways that should have raised flags long before they reached her desk. And then, in a voice that remained level, despite the weight of what he was about to say, he told her that one of her own senior executives appeared to be feeding confidential information directly to a rival firm. Amelia's first instinct was disbelief, the natural defense of someone who had already lost so much and could not bear to lose her own sense of who she could trust. She reminded him, not unkindly, that accusations without proof could destroy a career as easily as the truth could, and that she had already watched enough careers destroyed this year to take his warning lightly. Daniel did not argue with her doubt. Instead, he opened his laptop, connected it to the boardroom display with her permission, and within minutes walked her through lines of code and transaction trails that made the truth impossible to deny. By the time he finished, the office had gone completely silent, the only sound the soft hum of servers somewhere far below them, and Amelia understood that everything she thought she knew about her own company had just been quietly rewritten in front of her. She sat back in her chair, running through the last several months in her mind, every strange delay, every unexplained dip in performance, every meeting where numbers had not quite added up the way they should have. And she realized with a slow, sinking clarity that she had been so consumed by her own survival that she had missed the rot growing right beside her. She asked him, finally, the question that had been building since he first walked through her door. "Why come to me at all?" she asked, when it would have been so much easier to simply walk away and let the company fall apart on its own. Daniel considered the question longer than she expected before answering. "Because somebody has to be the one who does not walk away," he said quietly. And for reasons she could not fully explain, those words stayed with her long after he had gone. Word of what Daniel had uncovered spread through the upper floors of Halcyon Systems faster than anyone could contain it. And the reaction from the major investment funds was immediate and furious. Rather than treating the revelations as a warning worth heeding, several of the largest shareholders saw only chaos and opportunity intertwined, and they pushed harder than ever for an emergency sale of the company before the scandal could tank the stock price any further. Richard Kessler, representing the largest single block of shares, told Amelia bluntly that the board intended to force a vote within the week unless she agreed to sign over control to a group willing to absorb the losses quietly. If she refused, he promised lawsuits that would drag on for years and a mass withdrawal of capital that would leave Halcyon a hollow shell within months. He reminded her, in a tone that pretended to be gentle while cutting like a blade, that no jury in the country would side with a chief executive who ignored credible evidence of internal fraud simply because she trusted the wrong stranger's word over her own board's judgment. Amelia, exhausted and cornered, found herself wavering for the first time since the accident, wondering whether resistance was even worth the cost anymore. She thought about the months of sleepless nights, the headlines, the quiet, grinding humiliation of being underestimated in every meeting she entered, and for one brief, dangerous moment, she considered simply letting the pen fall where the investors wanted it to fall. If only to make the exhaustion stop. It was Daniel who steadied her. Standing quietly at the back of the room during one particularly brutal meeting, and speaking only when the shouting finally paused. "Do not sign anything yet," he told her afterward, his voice calm in a way that felt almost foreign inside those walls. He proposed something that sounded impossible to everyone who heard it. Give him 48 hours, and he would personally repair the compromised systems, expose the irregularities properly, and hand the board no choice but to reconsider. The investors dismissed the idea outright, unwilling to gamble the company's remaining credibility on an unknown man with no formal position and no legal standing. The other investors around the table nodded along with Kessler, some out of genuine agreement, others simply relieved that someone else was willing to say aloud what they had all been thinking in private for weeks. Amelia watched their faces, searching for even one flicker of hesitation, one person willing to consider that the story they had already written about her might not be the only version available. She found none. Richard Kessler simply laughed, the same laugh he had used a dozen times before, and repeated the words that would soon echo back at him in ways he never anticipated. "Want to save it," he said again, sliding the contract toward Daniel with theatrical certainty. "Then sign first." What Richard Kessler did not expect was that Daniel Brooks would actually pick up the pen, but the document Daniel signed was not the surrender agreement the investors had prepared, the one designed to strip Amelia of control and hand the company to outside buyers at a fraction of its worth. Instead, at Amelia's direction, her legal counsel had quietly drawn up an entirely different document overnight, one that placed full personal liability on Daniel's shoulders, in exchange for 48 hours of unrestricted access to fix what the board itself had failed to protect. Several people in the room actually laughed at what they assumed was a foolish, empty gesture from a man who had nothing to lose because he had nothing to begin with. That assumption did not survive the afternoon. Within hours, a team of corporate lawyers arrived at Amelia's request, carrying folders of notarized documents that had clearly been prepared, quietly and carefully, long before that morning's meeting had ever been scheduled. One of the lawyers, a composed older woman who had clearly handled far larger disclosures than this one, stood before the stunned board and began reading from a prepared statement in a voice that gave the investors no room to interrupt. She listed patents filed under a name none of them recognized at first, licensing agreements worth sums that made several people at the table visibly straighten in their chairs, and finally, the single detail that made the entire room go still. The buyer who had purchased those foundational patents years earlier and quietly relicensed them to nearly every major technology company in the industry, including Halcyon Systems itself, was the very man standing near the door in a coat that had clearly been through more winters than anyone in that room could imagine owning something so worn. Standing before the stunned board, they revealed something that silenced every voice in the building. The man in the worn brown coat, the man security had once laughed out of the lobby, was in fact the original architect behind the very technological framework that Halcyon Systems and dozens of its competitors had built their entire businesses upon. He had sold the rights to that foundational system years earlier under conditions of strict confidentiality, walking away with a fortune large enough to make even the wealthiest people in that boardroom look modest by comparison. He had simply chosen, in the years since, to live without any of the trappings that fortune usually demanded, believing that quiet, ordinary days with his children had been worth more than any headline his name might have generated. The room, moments earlier filled with mockery, fell into a silence so complete that the rain against the windows seemed suddenly loud. Richard Kessler's hand, still resting near the contract he had slid across the table only hours before, went still. Someone near the far end of the table let out a short, disbelieving laugh, quickly swallowed when no one else joined in. For the first time since the meeting began, every eye in that room turned toward Daniel, not with pity or suspicion, but with the particular, uneasy respect people reserve for someone they have badly misjudged. Over the following 2 days, Daniel worked with a focus that reminded Amelia of something she had almost forgotten existed inside these walls, a devotion to solving problems for their own sake rather than for applause. He set up a small operation in an unused conference room on the 9th floor. 3 borrowed monitors and a whiteboard covered in diagrams only he seemed able to read, and he barely left that room except to splash water on his face or accept the coffee that Amelia herself began quietly bringing him without being asked. He moved through the company's servers, correcting the vulnerabilities he had identified days earlier, closing the gaps before a coordinated cyber attack, already quietly in motion, could exploit them and cripple the entire network. Late on the first night, he found evidence of an intrusion attempt already underway, a probing signal testing the very weaknesses he had flagged in his original warning. And he understood in that moment just how close the company had come to losing everything before anyone in leadership had even agreed to listen. He worked through exhaustion that would have stopped most people 12 hours earlier, pausing only when Amelia, unable to sleep herself, wheeled into the room near 2 in the morning, and sat with him in silence rather than returning to her office alone. Neither of them spoke much during those quiet hours, but something steadying passed between them anyway, the particular understanding shared by 2 people who have both been counted out by everyone around them and have decided, quietly and separately, not to accept the verdict. As he worked, the deeper irregularities he had flagged came into full view, and the picture that emerged was worse than even he had suspected. The company's chief financial officer, a man named Marcus Johnson, who had sat beside Amelia in dozens of strategy meetings over the years, had been quietly funneling sensitive data to a rival firm in exchange for a position waiting for him once Halcyon collapsed under its own weight. 2 of the largest investors, including Richard Kessler himself, had been coordinating behind closed doors to manipulate the stock price downward, buying up shares cheaply while publicly declaring the company beyond saving. Federal investigators, alerted through Daniel's carefully documented evidence, opened an inquiry within days, and the fallout moved through the financial world with startling speed. Agents arrived at the building on a Thursday morning, moving through the executive floor with a quiet efficiency that felt almost surreal against the ordinary hum of the office around them. And, by the end of that week, 3 separate accounts tied to Marcus Johnson had been frozen pending further review. A young analyst named Victoria Hayes, who had joined the board only a year earlier and had always seemed slightly out of step with the rest of Kessler's allies, quietly approached Amelia afterward to say that she had suspected something was wrong for months, but had never possessed enough evidence to act on her instincts alone. The two women spoke for nearly an hour that afternoon, and by the time Victoria left the office, an unlikely alliance had formed that would carry the company through its final, difficult weeks of restructuring. As the truth surfaced, so did the market's confidence, and the stock price that had been in free fall for months began, cautiously at first, then with growing conviction, to climb back toward where it once stood. Clients who had begun quietly shifting to competitors returned within weeks, reassured not by promises but by the visible proof that Halcyon had rooted out the corruption threatening it from within. Marcus Johnson was escorted from the building on a Tuesday morning, his office boxed up before lunch, and the employees who had once deferred to him in meetings now spoke of him only in hushed, careful tones, the way people talk about a storm that has finally passed. Before he left, Amelia asked to speak with him alone for 5 minutes, a request her lawyers advised strongly against, and one she insisted on regardless. She did not raise her voice during those 5 minutes, though she had every right to, and instead simply asked him why. After 9 years of working beside her, he had chosen to help dismantle everything they had built together the moment her body gave the world a convenient excuse to doubt her. Marcus offered no real answer. Only a tired, unconvincing claim that he had believed the company was already finished and had simply tried to protect himself before the collapse, and Amelia watched him leave without another word, understanding that some betrayals never come with explanations satisfying enough to make sense of the damage they cause. Richard Kessler resigned from the board within the week, releasing a brief statement that mentioned nothing of the investigation and everything about pursuing other opportunities, a phrase that fooled no one who had watched the last several months unfold. The narrative that the press had written about a fallen genius past her prime dissolved almost overnight, replaced by a very different story about resilience under impossible pressure. In the days after the investigation broke wide open, Amelia found herself spending more time with Daniel than either of them had planned. First, out of necessity, as they untangled the last remnants of the compromised systems, and then simply because neither seemed eager to end the conversations once the work was finished. She learned, in fragments offered without prompting, that his children were grown and scattered across other states, that he called them every Sunday evening without fail, and that he had spent years deliberately choosing small, unremarkable jobs so that no one would ever again ask him to carry the weight he had once carried in his former life. She found herself telling him things she had not said aloud to anyone since the accident, about the nights she lay awake, wondering if her body had somehow betrayed the only thing she had ever been good at, about the specific, private humiliation of watching people decide her competence based on whether she could stand on her own 2 feet. Daniel listened without offering the easy reassurances everyone else reached for. The empty phrases about strength and resilience that had started to feel meaningless from repetition. Instead, he simply said that the people who mattered would judge her by what she built, not by how she moved through the room to build it, and something about the plainness of the statement landed harder than any of the polished sympathy she had received from people paid to manage her image. One evening, after a particularly long day spent briefing lawyers on the scope of the fraud, Daniel suggested they leave the tower entirely for an hour, an idea so unfamiliar to Amelia's routine that she almost refused out of habit before agreeing simply because she was too tired to argue. They ended up at a small coffee shop 2 blocks from the office, a place with mismatched chairs and a hand-lettered menu that had clearly never once considered accommodating a wheelchair. And Daniel, without making a production of it, simply moved a table aside so she could sit comfortably before either of them said a word about it. They talked for nearly 2 hours about nothing related to Halcyon at all, about the neighborhood he had grown up in, about a garden she used to keep before work consumed every spare hour of her life, about small, ordinary things that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or federal investigations. It was, Amelia realized, somewhere in the middle of that conversation, the first time in longer than she could remember, that she had felt like a person, rather than a problem waiting to be solved, and she found herself reluctant to let the evening end, even as the shop's lights began to dim around them. What happened next was not the kind of transformation people expect from stories like this one, because there was no miracle cure waiting at the end of it, no sudden recovery that erased the reality Amelia now lived with every single day. She remained in her wheelchair, and she always would, but something in the way she carried herself had shifted in a manner that no doctor could have prescribed. For the first time since the accident, she agreed to face the press directly, rather than through carefully worded statements drafted by a communications team eager to soften every hard edge. Her communications director argued against it for nearly an hour, insisting that a written statement would carry less risk than a room full of reporters who had spent months waiting for any excuse to paint her as fragile. Amelia thanked her for the advice and did exactly what she had already decided to do before the meeting began. She rolled onto a stage in front of cameras and reporters who had spent months questioning whether she still belonged at the head of her own company, and she did not hide behind a desk or a podium designed to disguise her condition. She spoke plainly about the accident, about the months of doubt, about the investors who had assumed her body's limitations meant her mind had failed alongside it. She described, without flinching, the night she had discovered the true depth of the betrayal inside her own leadership team and the strange, steadying gratitude she now felt for a stranger who had refused to let her fall twice. Leadership, she told them, has never lived in a person's legs. It lives in the willingness to keep making decisions when every voice around you insists you no longer have the right to decide anything at all. A reporter near the front asked, almost gently, whether she had ever considered stepping down during the worst of it. Amelia paused before answering. And when she did, her voice did not waver. Every day, she said, and every day I decided against it anyway. When she finished speaking, the room of hardened journalists and skeptical analysts rose to their feet in an applause that lasted far longer than any speech usually earned. And somewhere near the back of that room, standing quietly in the same worn brown coat he always wore, Daniel Brooks watched with a small, private smile that belonged to no one but himself. 3 months after that press conference, Halcyon Systems posted its strongest quarterly numbers in company history, surpassing even the records set before Amelia's accident had first threatened to unravel everything she had built. Analysts who had once written her off now studied her recovery as a case study, and business schools began requesting interviews about the crisis she had weathered, though Amelia turned down most of them, preferring to let the numbers speak for themselves. She had become, almost against her will, a symbol far larger than the company she led, a face that other people pointed to when they needed proof that circumstance did not have to dictate capability. Letters began arriving at her office from strangers, some in wheelchairs themselves, others simply exhausted by lives that had not gone according to plan. And she read every single one of them, keeping a small stack on the corner of her desk, long after most executives would have handed the task to an assistant. Daniel, true to the man he had always been beneath the borrowed toolbox and the quiet routines, refused every offer the board extended him, turning down not only a permanent seat on the leadership team, but the chief executive title itself, when a faction of grateful investors tried to press it into his hands. Richard Kessler's replacement on the board, a woman named Victoria Hayes, who had watched the entire ordeal with growing respect for both of them, argued for nearly an hour that a man of his experience owed it to the company to take a formal role. Victoria had spent the past several months proving herself a far steadier presence than Kessler had ever been, siding with Amelia in every close vote and pushing the rest of the board toward reforms that made a repeat of Marcus Johnson's betrayal far less likely, and her opinion now carried real weight in that room. Daniel simply smiled and said that he had already spent one lifetime chasing titles, and he had no interest in spending a second one the same way. He accepted only the role of advisor, a position that let him remain close enough to help without ever stepping into the spotlight he had spent years deliberately avoiding, and he continued taking small repair contracts around the city on the side, unwilling to let go entirely of the quiet, unremarkable life he had built for himself. On a clear evening not long after the announcement, the two of them found themselves on the rooftop terrace of the same glass tower where everything had nearly fallen apart, the city spreading out below them in a wash of lights that made the earlier storms feel like they belonged to another lifetime entirely. The rain that had followed them through so much of the past year had finally given way to a cold, clear sky, and Amelia found herself grateful for the simple fact of being able to sit somewhere quiet, without a phone buzzing against her leg every few minutes. Amelia broke the silence first, asking the question that had been sitting unspoken between them since the day she recognized his face on a lobby security screen. "Why did you help me?" she asked quietly, watching him rather than the skyline. Daniel considered the question for a long moment before answering, his voice softer than she had ever heard it in a boardroom. "Because that day," he said, "when everyone else in that garage and every room after it only saw a wheelchair, I saw someone who had never once stopped fighting." He told her, almost as an afterthought, that his late wife had spent her final year in a hospital bed, refusing to let anyone treat her as though she had already disappeared, and that something about the look in Amelia's eyes that day in the parking garage had reminded him powerfully of a fight he thought he would never witness again. Something in Amelia's chest loosened at those words in a way months of therapy and forced optimism had never quite managed to achieve. She had spent so long being seen as a problem to manage, a liability to contain, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to be seen simply as a person still standing, in whatever form standing now took for her. Without fully deciding to, she reached over and took his hand. And neither of them pulled away as the city lights burned steadily behind them, indifferent to everything that had almost been lost, and everything that had somehow, against every expectation in that boardroom, been saved. They stayed on that rooftop long after the wind turned cold, talking about nothing that mattered, and everything that did, and when Amelia finally wheeled back toward the elevator that night, she realized it was the first time in nearly a year that she had gone an entire evening without once thinking about the accident at all. In the weeks that followed, the two of them settled into an easy rhythm that neither had expected, but both had quietly begun to depend on, Daniel appearing at the office 2 or 3 days a week to consult on projects only he fully understood, Amelia finding excuses to walk the halls near his borrowed office even when her actual schedule pulled her elsewhere. Neither rushed to name what was growing between them, content instead to let it unfold at its own pace, the way the best things usually do, without headlines or announcements or anyone else's permission required. Employees who had watched the entire ordeal unfold began to notice the shift too. The way Amelia's laugh returned to meetings it had been absent from for months. The way Daniel, once determined to remain invisible, no longer seemed quite so eager to disappear the moment his work was finished. Sometimes, the person who changes the course of an entire empire is not the one holding the most power in the room. Sometimes it is simply the one willing to sign their name first, when everyone else is still waiting to see who else might fail.